Tonight, we're going to talk about the war chapters in the Book of Mormon. Now, anybody who's familiar with the Book of Mormon, you mentioned the war chapters, they pretty much know what you're talking about. This is the last third of the Book of Alma. It's around 20 chapters. And even though the Book of Mormon has warfare and violence pretty much throughout from beginning to end, this segment of the Book of Mormon is all war all the time. So these 20 chapters at the end of Alma, frequently called the war chapters. Now, apologists have looked at the war chapters as a way to try and prove the Book of Mormon is true and really happened. On the other hand, after we review it tonight, I think we're going to find out that in a lot of ways, the war chapters are nails in the coffin of the Book of Mormon as an ancient historical text. Join me tonight on Radio Free Mormon, won't you? All right, everybody. So here I've got some slides. Thanks for joining the show today. By the way, please hit like and please hit subscribe. I guarantee you're going to like it. So you can hit like now and feel good about it. Also, if you hit subscribe, that would be wonderful too. Here's the war chapters in the Book of Mormon. Like I said, the last third of the Book of Alma. Now, this is an old version of the Book of Mormon. By old, I mean around the time that I was getting baptized in the late 1970s, they had a limited run of paperback copies of the Book of Mormon that were bound in gold foil and had kind of the characters from what was thought to be the Charles Antone document on the cover. So the book itself is supposed to resemble the plates from which the Book of Mormon was taken. All I remember is that my friend Bruce, the one who baptized me, my best friend in high school, he gave me a copy of the Book of Mormon. I think it was in 1978. I think it was in the parking lot of the Puyallup Stake Center, which was located in Sumner, Washington, but the stake was Puyallup. And he handed it to me. It was a sunny day. The sun reflected off the cover of this book and into my eyes and made me almost blind. It made me wince. I know that Bruce thought, he joked about it later, saying that this was sort of like an act of God, blinding me with the Book of Mormon. In retrospect, I think God was trying to blind me with the Book of Mormon so I couldn't read all about church history over the next decades and then do podcasts like this. It was close, but no cigar. Okay, so this is the Book of Mormon he gave me. And the reason it's here in this slide deck is because Bruce told me he's trying to sell me on reading the Book of Mormon. And for whatever reason, he said, there's a lot of really exciting war chapters in the Book of Mormon. He's trying to make it appealing for an 18-year-old boy such as myself to want to read. It didn't work, but that was his pitch, the war chapters. So that's what it made me think of. I wanted to include that story here in honor of Bruce and in honor of my first copy of the Book of Mormon, which I unfortunately no longer have. Now, the good people at FARMS, the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, were putting out books about defending the faith and especially defending the Book of Mormon. And back in 1990, they came out with a big book, which was really a collection of papers that had been written for a symposium about warfare in the Book of Mormon. They collected those, they published them all under one volume titled Warfare in the Book of Mormon. And of course, as with all other forms of FARMS publications, say that 3 times fast, forms of FARMS publications, I got it because I wanted to learn everything I possibly could that would help me defend the Book of Mormon and Mormonism in general. So I got this book, read through it. I got to tell you, I wasn't really hugely impressed. They have more difficulties that they're dealing with that they have to overcome in the Book of Mormon regarding warfare than it really proving itself true, but they did the best they could. And I'm pretty much taking their word for it that this really is great evidence. But really, there's a lot of problems. They try and get around those problems, but then they run into more problems. And we're going to see some of that as we go forward today, because as part of what we're going to be doing today, we're going to talk about 5 different aspects of warfare in the Book of Mormon. And one of those aspects is going to deal with the arguments made by apologists in favor of this being evidence for the Book of Mormon. We'll get to it when we get to it. It'll be just a few minutes now. Now, I also have a picture up here of a Mormon apologist, and his name is Stephen Smoot, young Stephen Smoot. The reason I put him up here, juxtaposed to this book, Warfare in the Book of Mormon, is that I had this book pretty much since 1990. It's now around 2008. And Stephen Smoot, whom I know, not personally, but only through a message board. It was the old MAD message board, the Mormon Apologetic Discussion Board. And he and a bunch of other apologists, and like me, I was kind of an apologist at the time. That's what I'm doing there. He is going on a mission He's smart, he's clever, he's upcoming. So Stephen Smoot is interested in getting a copy of this book, Warfare in the Book of Mormon, but he's having trouble laying his hands on it because it's out of print. And apparently it's gotten very expensive. I just checked it on Amazon. It's up to $127 a copy. Well, I did not sell it to Steve Smoot. Instead, I got his address and I just shipped it to him gratis. And he was very grateful for it. And I'm sure it helped him prepare for his mission. He's gone on to even bigger and better things since then. So here's to you, Stephen Smoot. I hope you're doing well. And I hope that book was of benefit to you in helping you prepare to be the apologist that you still are for the LDS Church. All right. Number one issue out of 5. Okay. The Hill Cumorah is a clean site. And that has been known for many decades now. I think the first time I heard this term used about the Hill Cumorah was 20 years ago in 2005. And there's a Mormon archaeologist who was making this point that it is a clean site. In other words, there's no artifacts found there. There is nothing to support the Book of Mormon narrative that on this hill, hundreds of thousands and even millions of soldiers gathered to fight to the death. Now, it's tens of thousands in the Book of Mormon for the Nephite battle of extermination that happened on this hill, but you also get millions more because the Jaredites before them fought to the death on this hill too. The same hill known by a different name. The Book of Mormon makes that clear. So we have millions of people fighting to the death in all sorts of armor with all sorts of weapons on this little hill in upstate New York, and yet it becomes a clean site. There's nothing left. There's nothing there to indicate that any battle ever took place between any forces, much less forces numbering in the millions, which is a question that has been raised from time to time about the Book of Mormon. And it is because of this that many in the farms crowd have decided this can't be the real Book of Mormon, Hill Cumorah. Therefore, we have to look elsewhere, and we will look hundreds and even thousands of miles elsewhere until we find one that is big enough for it to possibly accommodate all the people that are mentioned being on it and fighting on it in the Book of Mormon. So this is a question that even Jasmine Rappley has pondered. No bones at the Hill Cumorah. How can that be? Yeah, it's a good question. And that's one of the reasons why they said, okay, it's got to be someplace else. The apologetic argument appears to run as follows. Number one, because the Hill Cumorah in New York is a clean site, meaning the battles described in the Book of Mormon as taking place there did not occur. And two, because the Hill Cumorah in New York is much too small to contain the millions of both Jaredite and later Nephites who fought a battle of extermination here. Therefore, number 3, the Book of Mormon is wrong. No, of course, that can't be the conclusion because it's an apologist talking, not a rational human being. So you got to scribble out number 3. And here's the number 3, the conclusion that the apologists arrive at. Not that the Book of Mormon is wrong, but that the Hill Cumorah must be someplace other than where Joseph Smith and the LDS Church say it is. It has to be somewhere other than the Hill Cumorah in upstate New York, you know, the one where they had the Hill Cumorah pageants for years before they were discontinued by the current occupant of the presidency of the Mormon Church, President Nelson. And here's a little funny meme where Jesus is saying about the Nephites and the Jaredites who all fought and died here, when I leave, be sure to erase all evidence of your existence. And they follow that commandment to a T. There is no evidence of their existence remaining. Here are the 2 Book of Mormon models. There's the Heartland model, which you can see, which is up there in North America. It's right around where Joseph Smith lived. It includes the Great Lakes. And then way, way south, thousands of miles south, you have the Mayan model or the Maya lands model or the Mesoamerican model. And those are 2 models for the Book of Mormon. Once again, one of the main reasons that there had to be a new model for the Book of Mormon, different from the one that Joseph Smith said, is because the one that Joseph Smith said, the Heartland model, ended up not turning up evidence to support it. So if we can't find the evidence where Joseph Smith said it should be, we'll go someplace else to find it. And we've got the entire Western Hemisphere to look. So this is where the intelligentsia at farms and at BYU continue to maintain the Book of Mormon took place down in Mesoamerica. Now, a number of years ago, also in 1990, coincidentally, I think, a letter was issued by the first presidency claiming and stating, as a matter of fact and well accepted verity, that the Hill Cumorah described in the Book of Mormon is the Hill Cumorah in upstate New York. Now, you might not think that that would be a remarkably controversial kind of opinion coming from the office of the first presidency. The only problem was that all the people at farms who know that that's not true, that Joseph Smith got it wrong, that it really wasn't on Cumorah in New York, it was way down in Mesoamerica and southern Mexico. They had a conniption fit over this letter. Now, here's the letter a little bit enlarged. Let me read it to you, okay? This is to Bishop Darrell L. Brooks. So, a member of Darrell Brooks' ward in Oklahoma City wrote a letter to the first presidency asking this question about where is Cumorah located? Is it the same one in the Book of Mormon as is in upstate New York? And the response comes back not from the first presidency, but from the secretary of the first presidency, who responds to a great deal, of course, of their correspondence. He sends it not back to this guy Sparks, who sent it in the first place, because that's not the way they do things in the Mormon church. Instead, they send it back to his bishop, who then is supposed to give it to him, apparently. But this letter was preserved, and that's the main thing. But that's why it says, Dear Bishop Brooks, and it's from F. Michael Watson, the secretary to the first presidency. Here's what the secretary says. I have been asked to forward to you, Bishop Brooks, for acknowledgement and handling the enclosed copy of a letter to President Gordon B. Hinckley from Ronnie Sparks of your ward. So they're not only sending this letter, but also the letter that prompted this response. Brother Sparks inquired about the location of the Hill Cumorah, mentioned in the Book of Mormon, where the last battle between the Nephites and Lamanites took place. The church has long maintained, okay, here we're getting to the good stuff. The church has long maintained, as attested to by references in the writings of general authorities, that the Hill Cumorah in western New York State is the same as referenced in the Book of Mormon. The brethren appreciate your assistance in responding to this inquiry and asked that you convey to Brother Sparks their commendation for his gospel study. Sincerely yours, F. Michael Watson, Secretary to the First Presidency. Well, when this was published, the Mesoamerican people, the farms people, went out of their minds because this flies in the face of their theory that it happened in Mesoamerica. So what they did was, amazingly enough, they appeared to have engaged in a conspiracy to create a second Watson letter. Now, I don't know if they created it, but they said it existed. They never produced it, but they swore on their deathbeds that it really was there. They claim that there is a second Watson letter that corrected this misapprehension that actually Hill Cumorah is in upstate New York. But they never produced it. In fact, Bill Reel and I did an episode about this over at Mormonism Live. And this was several years ago, about this very issue and the second Watson letter. It was titled Mormon Apologist Skullduggery, the Mystery of the Second Watson Letter, where we go through the evidence, and it looks a whole lot like they were just engaged in a fraud on the Mormon community to try and make them think that actually the first presidency had not said what the first presidency said about the Hill Cumorah and its location. So yeah, they were in a frenzy. They were like coyotes in a trap trying to chew their leg off to get free. But we caught them. We caught them, and the evidence is all there. Now, here's a picture of the Hill Cumorah from the air. You can see it is a nice little kind of hill. I understand it's called a drumlin hill. It was created by glaciers thousands and thousands of years ago. But it's not that huge a hill, especially when you're thinking about trying to get millions of people who are fighting millions of other people, and yet leaving no bones, no armor, no weapons, nothing, no relics or artifacts behind, which is an amazing feat when you think about it. But first off, they have to cram all of themselves on this hill. And I'm not sure you could get even standing side by side, much less fighting room and distance to swing a sword or what have you. I don't think you can do it. And so therefore, this is also an important thing that the apologists have done. They've recognized the size limitations of the Hill Cumorah in upstate New York. And so they have found a hill that is much bigger. In fact, it's a mountain in South America. This is Cerro de la Vigia, which is called Lookout Hill. I think that's the interpretation. You can understand why it would be called a lookout hill. That's a good place to have a lookout. And it's located in Veracruz, Mexico. See how much bigger this is? This is not just a hill. This is a mountain. Maybe you could get millions of people on this mountain, But the one in upstate New York, I don't think you really have much of a chance. So, how is it that Joseph Smith thought he could put millions of people in his story of the Book of Mormon on the Hill Cumorah, which was just down the road from where he lived? I mean, he knew the dimensions of the hill, he knew the numbers he was putting on the hill. So, why did he make this mistake? Well, I have a picture up now of the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. And the reason I have the Haunted Mansion up here is because I want to tell you a story. I think that Joseph Smith just made a mistake. The apologists would say, no, the Book of Mormon is correct, and therefore it didn't happen on this hill. It happened way down in Mesoamerica and southern Mexico, which, by the way, happens to accord with our theory that this is where the entire Book of Mormon happened. So we're right, and those Heartlanders, they're wrong. But actually, I think the answer is simpler than that. I think that Joseph Smith did put the numbers down in the Book of Mormon, and he did mean the upstate New York Cumorah, as he said on multiple occasions, as well as his associates did, to whom he told where the location of that hill was. But it's simply a matter of his overactive imagination. So, how does this play into the haunted house? Well, go back with me to when I was 12 years old. It's 1972, and I went to Disneyland for the very first time, and I was captivated. And especially was I captivated with the Haunted Mansion. So I came back from Disneyland, and now it is September of 1972. Halloween is coming up, and I want to create a haunted mansion. We're living in apartments in Kent at the time, but there's a clubhouse down by the swimming pool, and you can reserve the clubhouse if you live in the apartments. And we did that, and we were going to do that and make a haunted mansion for Halloween. So what I did first was I sat down with a pen and a piece of paper, and I drew a rough outline of what the clubhouse would look like from a bird's eye view. So I have the rough outline, and then I began drawing rooms inside of this haunted mansion diagram. And I remembered most of the rooms because I went through it multiple times at Disneyland. And so here's the haunted ballroom, and here's the entrance room, and here's the graveyard, and here's this, and here's that, and here's all these other wonderful rooms that they had in the haunted mansion. The only problem was, by the way, I thought I was doing great. I was so excited about this. The only problem was that when I took my diagram of the clubhouse with all of these haunted rooms in them and actually overlaid it on the clubhouse itself, I had created so many rooms because I was so excited about my project that the rooms themselves were incredibly small in actual dimensions. Some of the rooms would be like 2 feet by 3 feet wide. So even though I was able to write all these rooms down on the paper, in reality, those rooms were so small in size, 2 feet by 3 feet, some might have been 2 feet by 2 feet, that they wouldn't really work as a room in a haunted house. You could barely have somebody standing in it alone, not to mention having things going on in it that are haunted. And you certainly can't have what I wanted, which was people being able to pass through as they go about their little haunted mansion. Now, I remember that because I was so surprised that the reality of the situation was so different from what I had planned on my little map. And I expect that Joseph Smith's imagination ran away with him too, and he ended up inadvertently putting way too many people on this little hill that's down the road from where he lived, way too many people than could actually have been there and fought there if it had happened in reality. Much like the map of the Haunted Mansion, although it looked wonderful and I was so excited about it on paper, did not fit reality with the clubhouse. In the same way, the Book of Mormon doesn't fit reality with the Hill Cumorah, and I think it's for probably a similar kind of reason. So that's number one. Number two is there's no steel in ancient America and no swords. This is a real problem for the Book of Mormon, which describes steel and swords and steel swords in the ancient Americas. So the apologists have to get around this somehow. And we're going to talk a little bit now about what it is that they do in order to make this into something that's not so damning for the Book of Mormon, and also their attempts to make it a boomerang hit for the Book of Mormon and get some apologetic juice and mileage out of this argument. So the first thing that happens in that big book that I used to have that I gave to Steve Smoot, Warfare in the Book of Mormon, they teach me about the Maquahuitl, and that is my best attempt to pronounce this. It is a club that was used by ancient Aztecs and even earlier by Mayans although, of course, they were much nicer by the time they got to the Aztecs. It is a club of wood that has obsidian blades put into either side, and it can be swung and used as a hacking or a chopping instrument, or you could even call it a sword. I know that there's a lot of controversy about it. Obviously, the Mormon apologists prefer to call it a sword because then it's going to line up with the Book of Mormon. In other words, the Book of Mormon talks about swords. We've got to find something in the Mesoamerican area for the farms crew that is like a sword, and then make it match the Book of Mormon and say that's what the Book of Mormon is talking about. That's their mission. That's what they got to do. But this is what they come up with, is the Maquahuitl as the sword being talked about in the Book of Mormon. Now, the problem, of course, is that the Maquahuitl is not described at all in the Book of Mormon. It talks about swords, it talks about steel, it talks about it apparently in the traditional way that we would think of swords as being made out of steel. And yet we've got to squeeze this Maquahuitl in there somehow. So let's see how they do that. First off, they give some old pictures about ancient Americans using the Maquahuitl. So they can use that, they can cut off hands, they can cut off lots of different things with this weapon. And if you look in children's storybooks, when they're not having stories about, polygamy in the children's storybooks, they're having stories about these wars between the Nephites and the Lamanites. And you can see here that the Nephites are the white-skinned who have all the armor, and the Lamanites are the ones who have dark skin and no armor. But there's something else you'll notice. The Nephite has a traditional sword of steel. And you can see that on the left side of the picture. On the right side, you have the Lamanite coming at the Nephite, not with a traditional sword, but we recognize this now, don't we? He's got a Maquahuitl. And we know that the Nephites are probably going to win this battle because the steel swords are more advanced than the Maquahuitl. And we have evidence that the Maquahuitl was in existence anciently in America. There's no dispute about that. The problem is, of course, this other sword that this poor Nephite is holding. No, we haven't found any of those ever, and we don't expect to, because that technology was not had among the ancient Americans. So here is an article from Scripture Central. These are the apologist guys, and they're going to talk about this issue about steel swords and why it is that there are no steel swords in ancient America, even though the Book of Mormon talks about them, and try and make lemonade out of this lemon. The title of the article is "What Kinds of Swords Did Book of Mormon Peoples Use?" And we know where they're going to come down on because they got already two pictures of Maquahuitls there to lead us in the right direction. So there's a number of things that are problems, okay? They describe the Maquahuitl, but the Book of Mormon talks about many things that don't necessarily seem to match a Maquahuitl, like drawing swords. And they notice this. In Mosiah chapter 19, verse 4, it talks about drawing a sword. And now there was a man among them whose name was Gideon. Remember Gideon? And he, being a strong man and an enemy to the king, therefore he drew his sword. There's the relevant phrase. He draws his sword. And the problem with a Maquahuitl is that you can't really, or they didn't really, use scabbards. They didn't use sheaths. They didn't use anything from which they would draw this Maquahuitl. In fact, they probably cut through pretty much any material that they would have made for a sheath. So it wouldn't have worked. But this expression of drawing a sword occurs several times in the Book of Mormon, not only in Mosiah 19:4, but also in Alma 1:9, Alma 19:22, and Alma 20, verse 16. And what Scripture Central says about this is below in the slide. It says, however, Scripture Central has to admit, quote, sheaths did not seem to be used in the New World, period, end of quote. And then they cite to a few papers for that proposition. Well, if there's no sheath, then how is it that the Book of Mormon is talking about drawing swords, if indeed they mean the Maquahuitl? Okay, so they have to get around that, and they give some lame excuses. What I think are lame excuses, like carrying it in a bag and then pulling it out of the bag, and that's supposed to be what the Book of Mormon is saying is drawing swords. Yeah, not very persuasive. This is a problem, but the problems just get worse from here on out. Oh, here's another example, of course, of Nephi, who's talking about drawing a sword, right? Right before he kills Laban. 1 Nephi 4, 8, and 9. And when I came to him, I found that it was Laban. He's drunk and passed out in the street. And I beheld his sword, and I drew it forth from the sheath thereof. And the hilt thereof was of pure gold. Wow. And the workmanship thereof was exceedingly fine. And I saw that the blade thereof was of the most precious steel. Okay. That's the problem because he's got a blade of the most precious steel in this sword, which he is stealing from Laban and with which he's going to cut his head off here in a few moments. But notice he draws it forth. Once again, there's a scabbard or a sheath involved. And notice number 2, that the blade is of the most precious steel. Now, that's important because the sword of Laban is not a one off in the Book of Mormon. In fact, it tells us that Nephi takes that sword, they go all the way across the ocean to the promised land, they land in the Americas, and then Nephi, who really is apparently a master of all trades, starts making swords for his people, for his soldiers, that are replicas of the sword of Laban, which would apparently include the blades of steel in the Americas, which we haven't found and which we don't expect to find because they didn't have that technology. Another problem for the Book of Mormon. Here's what they say at Book of Mormon Central. Other passages hint at the possibility of other metal swords as well. They're trying to set forth the problem before they solve it. And I'm not sure they really solve it. They do a pretty good job of setting forth a problem, though. For example, Nephi said that he made swords after the manner of Laban's sword. This is a problem for the apologists. Weapon making is mentioned in conjunction with metallurgy several times. So, metal and weapons, weapons and metal, because the weapons are made out of metal. That's a problem. And jaredite, much earlier, jaredite weapons whose blades were cankered with rust were discovered by the Nephites and reported on in the Book of Mormon. So even the Jaredites, who arrived long before the Nephites, according to the Book of Mormon, in the New World, had swords with metal and steel blades. So these problems are just getting worse and worse for the Book of Mormon. Here are some of those references, by the way. I'm not going to read the entirety of them, but here they are. 2 Nephi 5:14. That's where Nephi takes the sword of Laban, and after the manner of it, did make many swords. So now he's got many swords after the manner of the sword of Laban, the description of which we already read. That's in the Book of Mormon too. In the book of Jerem, chapter 1, verse 8, it speaks about the brass and all these different metals like copper and iron, but also and steel. This is the quote, and steel, making all manner of tools of every kind to till the ground and weapons of war. So this is one of those examples where weapons of war is mentioned in connection with metals, including steel. Obviously, the weapons of war are made of steel. And then Mosiah chapter 8, verses 10 and 11, 11 talking about, and again, they have brought swords. This is where the report is made of the search party that found this huge battleground, which ended up being the Jaredites, and they find all of these different weapons and armor and all sorts of things that were left after this battle had happened. You know, the kind of things you'd expect to find after a big battle had happened where a lot of people were killed, the kind of things we don't find any shred of on the Hill Cumorah in New York. Yeah, those kind of things. But they find them. So this is one of the places where we know from the Book of Mormon that the Jaredites also had steel weapons. And it says, and again, they have brought swords. These are the explorers, the Nephite explorers. They have brought swords. The hilts thereof have perished, and the blades thereof were cankered with rust. Okay, cankered with rust, the blades. That doesn't sound like wood, and it doesn't sound like obsidian. It sounds like metal. It sounds like steel. And it sounds like the Book of Mormon is really consistent in this depiction it's giving of many swords being made with steel blades after the manner of the sword of Laban. And so they're everywhere, and we should have found them by now, but we haven't found any. What we found is that there was no technology like this for making steel swords back in Book of Mormon times, either Nephite or Jaredite. Here's another quote now from this paper at Scripture Central, and this is where they're trying to massage this information so it's not so damning to the Book of Mormon. Here's what they write. Yet these statements in the Book of Mormon that we just quoted, right? Yet these statements can be interpreted in different ways. Well, they better be able to be interpreted in different ways. Otherwise, the Book of Mormon is going to go down like a sinking ship. So here's where the creativity of the apologists comes in to come up with different ways that the Book of Mormon can be interpreted so it doesn't devastate the truth claims of the Book of Mormon. This is why apologists exist. This is why God created apologists to come up with these different interpretations. Nephi's swords may have been stylistically modeled on Laban's swords without being made of the same material. Are you kidding? What are you talking about? He said he made them after the fashion of the sword of Laban, but they're saying, oh, well, maybe he didn't really mean that. Oh my gosh. Okay, you got anything better? The mention of metallurgy and weaponry together only occurs a few times and could represent a limited and elite industry. I think that's ridiculous, actually. Now they're saying it's only mentioned a few times, and so therefore it doesn't have to be widespread. It could be a limited industry. We still haven't found any. Okay, that's the problem. And there's another problem with having steel swords being a limited and elite industry, which we'll get into in a second. They go on. Similarly, the discovery of jaredite metal weaponry and armor was probably noted precisely because it was so rare. I have no idea why they would think that. It's not because it was rare. It was because they found that there was other people who were living there and they'd had this huge battle. And these aren't Nephites, and this is a surprise. This is why it was noted, because it was noteworthy that they found evidence of other people who were living in the promised land, not because of what they had that they used to fight with. The Nephites had that stuff. The difference, they go on, the difference in archaeological evidence between dozens of metal swords and several million metal swords would be astronomical and could help explain why metal swords have not yet been discovered in ancient America. They're never going to be discovered in ancient America, guys. I hate to break it to you, but they're trying to say, well, there are only a few of these little metal swords, right? And so there weren't millions, so that's why we haven't found them yet, because there were just a few. Now, here's where I'm going to say that I don't think that makes any sense, that this is a limited and elite industry. The fundamental problem with considering steel weapons a limited technology is that it was the top of the line insofar as weaponry was concerned at the time. History tells us that such new weapons like copper and then bronze and then steel, right? History tells us that such new weapons technology spreads rapidly and quickly from culture to culture, as different societies did not want to go to battle with inferior weapons against the better armed host. Yeah, absolutely. They find out how it's done and then they start making them for themselves. It's an early version of the arms race, which is well attested, I believe, in the historical record. Especially would this be strange among Book of Mormon peoples when their history comprised 1,000 years. That's a long time to go without the Lamanites picking up on this kind of technology and without it spreading among the Nephites as well. In other words, why would it be a limited and elite kind of thing when the Nephites lived for 1,000 years? And not only that, we know that the claims that the Nephite record makes about the existence of steel swords were introduced not at the end of the Nephite record, but at its very inception. So we know they've got metal swords, steel blades at the very beginning of Nephite history. Nephi tells us in the Book of Mormon that he's making many such swords that are patterned after that sword. And so the natural thing would be, of course, they're going to continue to make them. Why would they have such a great technology for making weapons and then simply abandon it for an inferior technology? That doesn't happen. And yet that seems to be what it is the apologists are wanting us to believe happened in order to explain why it is there's no evidence for metal/steel weapons among the peoples in America who lived in Book of Mormon times. So here's another thing that they will say, and they say this in footnote 20 of the same article, that steel, as it's used in the Book of Mormon, doesn't really mean steel at all. In other words, it comes from a Hebrew word that simply means hard, and yet it was translated as steel in the Old Testament. So what they're trying to say is, okay, in the Old Testament, we got this Hebrew word. It means hard, but the King James Version translators translated it as steel. So really in the Book of Mormon, when it says steel, maybe all it means is hard. That Joseph Smith did the same mistranslation of the word that the King James Version translators did. I'm not sure it's a super compelling argument, even so far as it's already gone, but it gets worse. Here's what they say. The use of steel in the Book of Mormon has especially turned heads, as the term now commonly refers to carburized iron technology. steel. However, they write, the term originally meant simply to make something hard. And the word is used in the Old Testament as a mistranslation for bronze. And then they cite to some papers from, farms. It continues finally. Hamblin and Merrill suggest that Shual's, he's a Jaredite, that Shual's steel swords could have been a translational anachronism made by Mosiah or Moroni, who would have been familiar with Laban's steel sword. So this has all just been a problem in the words that were used. Now, the problem is that the Book of Mormon makes this explanation impossible. If you actually go to the Book of Ether and read about this character named Shual, you will see that this argument from the apologists cannot work. They're saying that the word translated as steel meant hard, right? So you could say, well, they wrote hard weapons and it was translated steel weapons. The problem is that the Book of Ether is much more specific. Ether 7, 8, and 9. And it came to pass that Shual was angry with his brother. Okay. And then in verse 9, wherefore he, Shual, came to the hill Ephraim, and he did molten out of the hill and made swords out of steel. You see, it's being very specific. It's saying he made the swords out of steel. It's not that these are just steel swords, which might be a mistranslation, which apparently, according to the apologists, the Book of Mormon abounds in. No, the Book of Mormon says not steel swords, but that he molten out of a hill and made swords out of steel. You wouldn't say made swords out of hard if you're a Hebrew, for crying out loud. It's obvious that it's talking about real steel being really molten out of a real hill in the Book of Mormon. For those whom he had drawn away with him, that's who he made the swords for. And after he had armed them with swords, he returned to the city Nehor, gave battle unto his brother Korihor, etc. So these are already many, many, many swords, which are made by molting out of a hill and by making the swords out of steel, as the Book of Mormon says. So the apologists are once again playing fast and loose with the truth on this one. They're giving an argument that does not match the actual language used in the Book of Mormon they seek to defend. This is an interesting idea that the apologists have, that of stained swords. This is one of the more interesting ideas that I remembered from my reading of the book, Warfare in the Book of Mormon. So the idea is that the Book of Mormon talks about swords being stained. And if it were a Maquahuitl, well, you've got wood there. So, of course, wood can be stained, but steel, not so much. So the apologists try and use this reference to swords stained with blood, which I think is what the people of anti-Nephi Lehi are concerned about. And so they bury their weapons of war, right? Because they don't want them to be stained with blood, because the blood on their weapons would then be a testimony against them at the last day, and things would not look good for them in front of God. Here's what the apologist writes about this. One great strength of this identification of Nephite swords being made of wood is the Ammonites' powerful concerns about stained swords. That's in Alma chapter 24. While this staining could simply be an idiom or figure of speech. Okay, wait a second here. They use that as a partial clause because it looks like it's an idiom. It looks like it's a figure of speech. It looks like it's a metaphor. Okay, if it's a metaphor, this entire argument crashes and burns. So they're just going to put it as a possibility, not even its own sentence, just a clause before they get to the real point they're trying to make. While this staining could simply be an idiom or figure of speech, it is. Wooden weapons literally absorb blood and become permanently stained, unlike metal weapons, which can be easily wiped clean. So here's the idea, right? This idea about stained swords, stained with blood, more accurately fits the description of a Maquahuitl made out of wood than it would a real sword made out of steel, and therefore it's not a real steel sword, and this is evidence to show it. The problem is not only that it's a weak argument, the problem is that I actually went the extra step, and when I was preparing for this, I'd never done this before. I'm preparing for the show, and I thought, is that even true? Because I know that the apologist believes it's true, and they're stating it's true. And by that, I mean that metal weapons don't get stained with blood. But do I know that's true? Or is that something I'm just going along with because they're stating it as a fact? The first thing I noticed was they don't cite to any kind of article for this that would be concerned about the issue of whether steel can be stained with blood. But all it took was a little bit of Googling, and I found that actually steel, even high carbon steel, can be stained or discolored from blood. My search took me to a webpage called Knife Dogs, people talking about knives and blades and steel and such. And here is this question and answer on that website, which is reflective of what I found elsewhere throughout the internet. Question from March 14th, 2016. Anybody ever have discoloration on a carbon steel blade from blood? Specifically, 1095 blade, that's a type of steel, was stained / discolored, cleaning a few dozen fallow deer. Does anyone have a suggestion for cleaning up the staining? Any tricks? Thank you in advance for any responses. Demo. And then the response comes back the same day. The response is not saying, what, are you out of your mind? Steel doesn't get stained by blood. Just read the Book of Mormon. No, it says, that's completely normal. Just about any non-stainless steel will discolor or stain if it comes into contact with blood. And then it talks about the different things that can happen with the staining and what you can do about it. But I was surprised. I totally learned something new. I just thought on the off chance that this idea that steel cannot be stained with blood is wrong. Let me check it out. And I found out it is wrong. So what the apologists are saying here, and what I used to think was true, is completely wrong. In other words, when they say, while this staining could simply be an idiom or figure of speech, wooden weapons literally absorb blood and become permanently stained, unlike metal weapons, which can be easily wiped clean. Wrong. Metal weapons, steel weapons can be stained by blood as well. And therefore, your best argument, this really was their best argument for these swords in the Book of Mormon not being made of steel, but being made of wood, goes down the toilet with this discovery. Okay, number 3, a tricky stratagem used twice in the Book of Mormon. Let me tell you about this tricky stratagem, okay? There are 2 places in the Book of Mormon, in the war chapters, where the same stratagem is used by the Nephites against the Lamanites in the war chapters. And these chapters are Alma chapter 52 and then Alma chapter 56. And essentially, this is the same stratagem used twice against the Lamanites. They will fall for it the first time. They'll fall for it the second time. They'll fall for it every time because they're Lamanites. And this stratagem has to do basically with this, that the Nephites are trying to get the Lamanites to come out of their fort, and the Lamanites don't want to come out of their fort because they've got a good defensive position. So the Nephites take their armies, divide them into 2, secrete part of the army in the forest or in a ravine or somewhere where the Lamanites can't see them from their fort, right? And then they put them nearby the fort, and then they walk the other part of their army out in front of the Lamanites or down by the seashore or wherever it says, so that the Lamanites can see them. It's a much smaller group, and the Lamanites think, oh my gosh, we can totally overpower them and kill all those Nephites. Let's all run out of our fort. Let's leave it virtually defenseless, and let's go get those Nephites. And while the Lamanites are chasing after the Nephites, now the hidden Nephites, the bigger force, now runs into the fort, kills anybody who's left, and takes over the fort. It's a brilliant strategy. If that ever worked, you would think it would only work once, because then everybody would get the idea and not fall for that anymore. It's like Loki says to Thor in the first Avengers movie, are you ever not going to fall for that? Well, the Lamanites will fall for it again and again. Now, I'm going to read these very quickly because the Book of Mormon cannot tell a story very quickly. It's a bit lengthy, but I want to read it very quickly so you can get an idea for this, because once we get done talking about these stories, we're going to look at a likely source where Joseph Smith got the idea for these stories in the first place, and the idea for this stratagem, which are used by his Nephites not once but twice against the Lamanites. So, Alma 52, the first time the strategy is used, right? We start in verse 19. In the commencement of the 28th year, Moroni and Teancum, many of the chief captains, hold a council of war, what they should do to cause the Lamanites to come out against them to battle, that they might flatter them out of their strongholds and gain advantage over them and take again the city of Mulek. So this is all about the city of Mulek that's in dispute. And they sent embassies to the army of the Lamanites, which protected the city of Mulek, to their leader, desiring him that he would come out with his armies to meet them upon the plains between the two cities. And he says, nothing doing. We're not coming out to fight you. So now they have to figure out a way to get him to come out. And it came to pass that Moroni, having no hopes of meeting them upon fair grounds, therefore he resolved upon a plan that he might decoy the Lamanites out of their strongholds. Therefore he caused that Teancum should take a small number of men and march down near the seashore, and Moroni and his army by night marched in the wilderness. So here's the second part of the army, right? On the west of the city Mulek. It's even on the west of the city. We'll see that again later. Make a note of that. On the west of the city Mulek. That's where the other army is hidden. And thus on the morrow, when the guards of the Lamanites had discovered Teancum and his army, right, they ran and told it unto Jacob, their leader. And the armies of the Lamanites did march forth against Teancum. They're abandoning their fort, supposing by their numbers to overpower Teancum because of the smallness of his numbers. And as Teancum saw the armies of the Lamanites coming out against him, he began to retreat down by the seashore northward. Now, when the Lamanites saw that he began to flee, they took courage and pursued them with vigor. And while Teancum was thus leading away the Lamanites, behold, Moroni commanded that a part of his army who were with him should march forth into the city and take possession of it. See, that's how this trick works. And this they did, and slew all those who had been left to protect the city. Yea, all those who would not yield up their weapons of war. Well, obviously, it wasn't many people left to protect the city. Otherwise, they could have protected the city. And thus Moroni obtained possession of the city Mulek with a part of his army, while he marched with the remainder to meet the Lamanites when they should return from the pursuit of Teancum. And it goes on, and I'm not going to read this whole thing. I'll put the slides up here. It goes on, and I think that we know the story. That's the main part of the story. Now, the second time the stratagem is used is in Alma chapter 56, and it's a variation on the story. But once again, what the Nephites do is they use a small band or a small army to march in sight of the spies of a group of Lamanites that are in a fort, and they lure them out of the fort to come chasing after the Nephites, and they use this to their advantage. So here's Alma 56, where the second time this strategy is used. I'm not sure that this story has the additional detail of the other Nephites rushing into the city and taking the city, but they're definitely able to lure out a huge army of the Lamanites to come pursuing them. And what ends up happening is that the armies of the Lamanites pursue the 2,000 stripling warriors, and they then realize they're being pursued by the other military force, which was the army, I believe, of Antipas in this story. So you've got the big body of Lamanites, the big army of Lamanites chasing the 2,000 stripling warriors who themselves are being chased by this other Nephite army of Antipas. And it's like this race through the jungle if you're in Mesoamerica, or this race through the forest if it's a heartland theory. But the story plays out to the advantage of the Nephites. However, I'm not really that much interested in reading the entire story. It's in Alma 56. It starts in verse 20. It goes on and on. It really does take quite a while for the Nephite record to tell this story. And I'll show you, there it is up here. It's continuing to verse 39, down to verse 42, even to verse 45, and yea, unto verse 51. And finally, ending basically in verse 54. So that's a long story, but that's pretty much what happens. It is a basic repeat of the same strategy, and the Lamanites fall for it again. Now, the question that I have is, where did the Nephites come up with this strategy in the first place? Because you know what? The exact same strategy is mentioned in the book of Joshua, chapter 8. You remember the book of Joshua? Joshua is the guy who takes over after Moses passes away, and now it's up to Joshua to lead the Israelites in a war of conquest against the people who inhabit the promised land. And chapter 8 is one of the battles in which this happens. And you're going to find out that this sounds very familiar. Joshua chapter 8, verse 3 starts. So Joshua arose and all the people of war to go up against Ai, and Joshua, that's a city. And Joshua chose out 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them away by night. And he commanded them, saying, Behold, ye shall lie in wait against the city, even behind the city. Go not very far from the city, but be ready. And I and all the people that are with me, Joshua says, will approach unto the city. And it shall come to pass, when they come out against us, as at the first, that we will flee before them. For they will come out after us, till we have drawn them away from the city. For they will say, They flee before us as at the first, therefore we will flee before them. Then ye shall rise up from the ambush, and seize upon the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. And it shall be, when you have taken the city, that ye shall set the city on fire, according to the commandment of the Lord shall ye do. See, I have commanded you. Does this sound familiar yet? And now it goes and it tells us that not only was this the plan of Joshua, but they actually did it, and everything went according to plan. Joshua therefore sent them forth, and they went to lie in ambush and abode between Beth-el and Ai, on the west side of Ai. Remember, the west side. Now, there's only 4 directions, but it's interesting that in Joshua, the hidden army hides on the west side of the city, and the same thing happens in Alma chapter 52. The west side of the city is where they hide themselves. And Joshua rose up early in the morning and numbered the people, and went up, he and the elders of Israel, before the people to Ai. And all the people, even the people of war that were with him, went up and drew nigh and came before the city, pitched on the north side of Ai. This is the army that they're supposed to see. Now there was a valley between them and Ai. And he took about 5,000 men, set them to lie in ambush between Beth-el and Ai on the west side of the city. And when they had set the people, even all the host that was on the north of the city, and their liers in wait on the west of the city, Joshua went that night into the midst of the valley. And it came to pass that when the king of Ai saw it, that they hasted and rose up early, and the men of the city went out against Israel to battle, he and all his people, at a time appointed, before the plain. But he wist not, he knew not, that there were liers in ambush against him behind the city. You're not supposed to know. That's the whole point. And Joshua and all Israel made as if they were beaten before them, and fled by the way of the wilderness. And all the people that were in Ai were called together to pursue after them. And they pursued after Joshua, and were drawn away from the city. And there was not a man left in Ai or Bethel that went not out after Israel. And they left the city open, and pursued after Israel. And the Lord said unto Joshua, Stretch out the spear that is in thy hand toward Ai, for I will give it into thine hand. And Joshua did so. And the ambush arose quickly out of their place. And they ran as soon as he had stretched out his hand. That was a signal. And they entered into the city and took it, and hasted and set the city on fire. And when the men of Ai looked behind them, they saw, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended up to heaven. And they had no power to flee this way or that way. And the people that fled to the wilderness turned back upon the pursuers. And when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, then they turned again and slew the men of Ai. It sounds like it's right out of the Book of Mormon, doesn't it? And the other issued out of the city against them, the other Israelites who'd gone in and taken the city, the 5,000, right? So they were in the midst of Israel. The people of Ai are in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side. The ones that they had been pursuing who turned back on them, and the ones who were in the fort who had taken it were now coming out after them from behind. And they smote them so that they let none of them remain or escape. And the king of Ai they took alive and brought him to Joshua. And finally it says, And it came to pass that when Israel had made an end of slaying all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness wherein they chased them, and when they were all fallen on the edge of the sword, until they were consumed, that all the Israelites returned unto Ai and smote it with the edge of the sword. So everybody gets killed by the Israelites here. It's a complete victory. So the apologists, what are they going to say in response to this? I mean, it seems like the Nephites got their ideas for Nephite stratagems from the book of Joshua, chapter 8. And indeed, I think it's likely they did. What will the apologists say? Well, it's obvious what the apologists will say. They will say that the Nephites had the book of Joshua on the brass plates. And so they read it there and they thought, this is a great strategy. We'll use it against the Lamanites. Now, of course, this depends upon the Lamanites not knowing this strategy as well, because they can't know it. Otherwise, they won't fall for it, right? They'll just say, hey, that's Joshua chapter 8 they're trying to pull on us. Nice try, Nephites. So the apologists have to say two things. Number one, the Nephites got the strategy directly from the book of Joshua. And two, the Lamanites didn't have the brass plates or couldn't read, so they fell for it. Now, the problem with this response is that the Book of Mormon refutes it, because the Book of Mormon tells us that the leaders of the Lamanites at this time were actually Nephites who had dissented from the Nephites. The first one is Amalickiah, and then the second one is Ammoron, Amalickiah's brother, also a Nephite, when Amalickiah gets killed. And Alma 47:36 tells us, now these dissenters having the same instruction and the same information of the Nephites, yea, having been instructed in the same knowledge of the Lord. These dissenters know everything that the Nephites know. They know what's on the brass plates. They know what's in Joshua. They know about these stratagems. So why are they falling for it? That's the problem that the Book of Mormon gives us. Not only that the Book of Mormon replicates strategies from Joshua chapter 8, but that the Nephites, led by dissenters, who the Book of Mormon itself tells us had the same instruction and the same information as the Nephites, act as if they don't have any clue about this stratagem and fall for it, not once, but twice in Alma chapter 52 and 56 in the Book of Mormon. And I think that's a problem for the Book of Mormon. You let me know if you think that's a problem for the Book of Mormon, or if that somehow proves its authenticity. Now, that's number 3. Number 3 was a long one. Number 4 and number 5 will be much shorter. We're almost to the end of this podcast. By the way, I need to ask you right now, please hit like, please hit subscribe, please leave a comment below. And if you have not already, please go to radiofreemormon.org and make a donation there. A continuing donation, a monthly donation is optimal. $5 a month is all I ask. If you want to give more, that's fine, but it's totally up to you. Your contributions do keep Radio Free Mormon broadcasting behind enemy lines. And thank you so much to all of you who have gone to radiofreemormon.org and made that contribution already. All right, number 4, the book of Joshua, chapter 8, hanging. This is at the end of that story where they bring the king of Ai out and hang him. So, chapter 8, verses 28 and 29, and Joshua burnt Ai, the city, made it a heap forever, even a desolation unto this day. One might even call it an abomination of desolation, which is a name that we hear in the Book of Mormon about a city that gets destroyed. I think that was Ammonihah. So in Joshua, it's a desolation. In the Book of Mormon, it's an abomination of desolation. And then finally, verse 29, and the king of Ai he hanged on a tree until eventide. And as soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded that they should take his carcass down from the tree and cast it at the entering of the gate of the city, and raise thereon a great heap of stones that remaineth until this day. So that's what happens to the king of Ai in Joshua chapter 8. Now, in the Book of Mormon, not in the war chapters, but in 3 Nephi chapter 4, the Nephite army vanquishes an enemy army and does the same kind of thing with their leader. 3 Nephi 4:27. And there were many thousands who did yield themselves up prisoners unto the Nephites, and the remainder of them were slain. And their leader, Zemnarihah, not to be confused with Zarahemla, their leader, Zemnarihah, was taken and hanged upon a tree. Wow, just like the king of Ai. Yea, even upon the top thereof until he was dead. And when they had hanged him until he was dead, they did fell the tree to the earth and did cry with a loud voice, saying, May the Lord preserve his people in righteousness and holiness, etc. Okay? So it appears that the Book of Mormon may be borrowing from Joshua not only for this strategy, but also for hanging of a leader of the enemy of the Nephites, even as it was done to the king of Ai in Joshua chapter 8. Now, finally, this is going to be number 5. which is a remarkable story from Joshua chapter 10. It has to do with the sun standing still in the sky in order to allow the children of Israel to complete their victory and vanquishment and slaughter of, I believe it was the Ammonites in this story. The critical verse in Joshua 10 being verse 13. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. So here it is, number 5, Joshua describes a geocentric universe. So you understand that a geocentric universe means that, of course, the earth is at the center of the universe and everything revolves around the earth, including the sun and including the moon, which is implicit in this story that if we need to lengthen out the day by stopping the sun going around the earth, that is describing a geocentric universe, which makes sense because a geocentric universe was widely believed at the time that the book of Joshua was written. Here it is in 12 and 13 of Joshua chapter 10. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites. It was the Amorites, not the Ammonites, before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? I mean, if it's written in the book of Jasher, then it must be true. So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. Once again, obviously describing a geocentric universe. Now, the interesting thing is that even though in the Book of Mormon it does not have this miracle recreated, it references this miracle. This is the only time this miracle happens in anywhere in the Bible. This idea about the sun standing still. To my knowledge, and I'm pretty familiar with it, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a unique miracle in the Bible. It's a unique miracle in all the standard works that the Mormons believe are scripture. But a reference is nevertheless made to this incident in the Book of Mormon in the context of talking about God having all power to do whatever it is he wants. So obviously, whoever's writing this in the Book of Mormon knows about this story from reading Joshua. And here's what it says in the Book of Mormon, specifically the Book of Helaman, chapter 12, verses 13 through 15. And notice here that the Book of Mormon, even though it knows about this geocentric story from Joshua, is going to reframe the story and insist that the geocentric telling of it is wrong, because really the sun doesn't revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. The author of the Book of Mormon understands that a geocentric universe is not the way things really are, but believes that a heliocentric universe, where the earth revolves around the sun, is the truth. And here's how this shows up in the Book of Mormon. Really fascinating. Yea, and if God say unto the earth, move, it is moved. Remember, he has all power. Yea, if he say unto the earth, thou shalt go back, that it lengthen out the day for many hours, it is done. Now notice he's not talking to the moon, and he's not talking to the sun. He's talking to the earth. Yea, if God saith unto the earth, thou shalt go back, that it lengthen out the day for many hours, it is done. And then to put a fine point on it, and thus, according to his word, the earth goeth back, and it appeareth unto man that the sun standeth still. Okay? Yea, and behold, this is so, for surely it is the earth that moveth, and not the sun. So here the Book of Mormon references the story in Joshua and takes the liberty of correcting the story in Joshua, because the author of the Book of Mormon has more advanced scientific understanding of the universe. The Book of Joshua references a geocentric universe, but the Book of Mormon references a decidedly heliocentric universe. As most of you know, it was not until the 16th century that a mathematical model of a heliocentric system was presented by the Renaissance mathematician, astronomer, and Catholic cleric Nicholas Copernicus, leading to the Copernican revolution. In 1576, okay, this is way after Joshua, but still before the Book of Mormon. In 1576, Thomas Digges published a modified Copernican system. His modifications are close to modern observations. In the following century, Johannes Kepler introduced elliptical orbits, and Galileo Galilei presented supporting observations made using a telescope. So even though this has been around for quite a while, the heliocentric universe, for several hundred years, and we're quite accustomed to viewing things in this way, as was Joseph Smith, by the way, this is not the way it was back in the time of the Book of Mormon, or at least the time that the Book of Mormon represents itself as having been written. Once again, I thought I would take a look and see what Adam Clarke and his commentary had to say about this passage in Joshua, because Adam Clarke knows about the heliocentric universe. He knows this contradicts the heliocentric universe, and he's got to make some kind of excuses for it. It's a massive entry in the Adam Clarke Bible commentary, which once again was known to Joseph Smith, and which he had access to, and which he almost certainly read this part as well. Now, I've just taken a big paragraph out, okay? There are many paragraphs because there's a lot of explaining to do for a believer that the Bible is literally the word of God and is God inspired, and yet seems to have a theory in it that's the opposite of what every intelligent person believes when Adam Clarke is writing this. Sun is the center. The earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around. So here's what he says. And imagine Joseph Smith reading this, because remember, he talked about the earth being commanded to remain still, not the sun. Adam Clarke will actually use that expression about commanding the earth to remain still. All right. Even though he doesn't think that that's the way it would have been done. He thinks that actually the earth did remain still, that God did not command the earth to remain still, but God commanded the sun to remain still because the sun is a more advanced or earlier or more primordial creation than the earth, and therefore has power over it. Yeah, it's not the best explanation ever, but he's doing the best job he can. I'm not going to read this entire paragraph, but I do have a couple of parts highlighted where he talks about Joshua requested that that influence might be for a time restrained, that the diurnal motion of the earth might be arrested. So basically what he's going to say is, he wouldn't say to the earth, be still, although scientifically that's what he would have to say, because it is the earth that revolves around the sun. He would have to say that the rotation of the earth had to be stilled in order for the sun and the moon to appear still in the sky. But he's going to say he could have said to the earth, be thou still, but he wouldn't do that because the sun is the master creation, and therefore you talk to the sun when you want the earth to do something. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but here's what he has to say. Had he said, earth, stand thou still. Okay, wait a second. He said, had he said, earth, stand thou still. What is it that the Book of Mormon says? What did it say? Verse 13, yea, and if he say unto the earth, move, it is moved. Yea, if he say unto the earth, thou shalt go back, that it lengthen out the day for many hours, it is done. So the Book of Mormon has God speaking to the earth. Joshua has God speaking to the sun. And Adam Clarke says that Joshua could have said, earth, stand thou still. Had he said, earth, stand thou still, the cessation of whose diurnal motion was the effect of his comment, it could not have obeyed him. Why? As it is not even the secondary cause, either of its annual motion around the sun or its diurnal motion round its own axis. Instead of doing so, he speaks to the sun, the cause under God of all these motions. So he's arguing that the sun is the cause of the motions of the earth. Therefore, he talks to the sun in order to get the earth to stop. But that he could have said, earth, stand thou still, because that's really what's happening. And indeed, the Book of Mormon seems to follow that lead in saying a very similar thing about commanding the earth to either move or to stand still or to go backward. So another possible connection with Adam Clarke and the story about the sun standing still, as found in Joshua and referenced in the Book of Mormon. Joshua's description of the sun going backward in its movement indicates a geocentric model of the universe, one widely believed in ancient times. The Book of Mormon's insistence that it is the earth that goes backward and not the sun reflects a more modern heliocentric model of the universe, one not widely accepted until the 16th century. While the Book of Mormon seeks to correct Joshua, it inadvertently exposes the time period in which it was composed, i.e., after the 16th century. So, conclusion, the 5 things we've covered are: the Hill Cumorah is a clean site. There is nothing found there. There is no armor. There is no bones. There are no artifacts. There could not have been a huge battle fought there, as described in the Book of Mormon and as affirmed by the Watson letter, the first presidency in that 1990 letter, that indeed the Hill Cumorah in New York is the Hill Cumorah where the final battle took place as described in the Book of Mormon. That's a problem. Number two, no steel swords in ancient America. That's a problem. And we've seen that the more the apologists struggle to get free of this problem, the more they become trapped by it. Number three, there was a stratagem that was used twice by the Nephites in the Book of Mormon, Alma 52 and 56. The Lamanites fall for it both times, and it appears that this was borrowed from the Book of Joshua. Number four, there's a hanging of a captured leader in Joshua and also in the Book of Mormon. And finally, number five, the Book of Mormon corrects Joshua's geocentric model of the universe because the Book of Mormon obviously was written by somebody in a time period that believed in the heliocentric model of the universe. Well, that is about all for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Thank you for joining me. Once again, please hit like, please hit subscribe. If you've made a donation, thank you so much. Your donations, once again, do keep Radio Free Mormon broadcasting behind enemy lines. As I say, that's about all for tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Please join me next time for another exciting episode of Radio Free Mormon. Until then, this is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.